Today's topic is speciation, or how do new species emerge? And then we'll also look at the pace and pattern of that emergence of new species over time. All right, so what is a species technically? I know you have an idea of what that is in general, but what is the actual definition? Well, there is more than one definition. Actually, there's more than two. I'm going to talk about two definitions, but these are the two most common, and this first one is the really big important one that is used basically unless we can't use it. And that is that a species is a group of organisms that can successfully interbreed only with each other. And remember, successful breeding means viable, fertile offspring. So like I said, this is the most commonly used species concept, and we will use it unless we can't, but there are exceptions. Like, for example, bacteria, they don't reproduce with each other. They don't reproduce sexually. They reproduce by binary fission, by, basically cloning themselves. So it doesn't work for them. We need to have some kind of other definition that will work for other groups or individuals that have gone extinct. It also, like, you can't check if they can reproduce if they're all dead, right? So that's why we have more than just this one concept. Here's an example of the biological species concept in action. The eastern and western meadowlark look identical. You're looking at a picture of each of those. You would not be able to tell them apart, right? And they live in the same place. But because they have different mating behavior, so they give different mating calls, they don't recognize each other as potential mates, so they don't interbreed successfully. And that's what makes them different species according to the biological species concept. All right, so if that biological species concept doesn't apply, what are we going to use? We're going to use this usually. It's the morphological species concept. Morphology is what something looks like or the shape of something. So this is basically like, do they look the same? Not only on the outside, but internally. So if you're looking at for different structures, etc., and that's how you can classify them. This is what we use for bacteria, for example. But I just wanted to give you an example of where that doesn't always work. Here are two ants that are actually of the same species. Either they have different jobs, so they look very different from each other because they have very different jobs for the ant colony, but either one of those could successfully interbreed with a male in the colony, so they are the same species. The morphological species concept is not what we would use to identify this one. So we know what a species is. Let's talk about how new species emerge. That emergence is called speciation, and there are two types: allopatric and sympatric. In allopatric speciation, a population is separated physically, like geographically, such that there's no gene flow happening between the two groups, and presumably each of those two groups is going to respond to selection pressures in their own environments, ultimately becoming so different that they become reproductively isolated, and you have two new species. In sympatric speciation, the new species is evolving in the same geographic space or region as the original species, but they have started to exploit some new niche within that geographic area. So that could be like a new physical area, like they're moving up into the trees way higher, or they could start eating a new food or doing something that makes them different from the ancestral population. And over time, they will become so different that, again, they'll become reproductively isolated and be two separate species. I just want to remind you, yes, speciation happens in plants too. We talk about animals all the time, I think just because they're kind of like more interesting in a lot of ways, but it happens for plants too, and that provides this really cool visual here for those two types. So you can see in the allopatric, we have a physical separation by this river forming, and then in sympatric speciation, we have that new species exploiting a new niche and becoming a new species within that original geographic area. I mentioned becoming reproductively isolated or unable to interbreed successfully. Let's look more deeply at that. There are two main categories of reproductive isolation: prezygotic barriers that basically prevent a zygote from being formed or a fertilized egg, and post-zygotic barriers, which prevent that fertilized egg from developing into a viable, fertile adult offspring. So both of these, either whether it happens before the zygote or after, that will maintain the isolation and prevent gene flow between populations. Prezygotic barriers, like I said, prevent the formation of a fertilized egg. So that's going to be preventing mating or hindering fertilization. What I mean by that is like the gametes will not come together to form a zygote, even if they are actually together. 5 types. We'll look at all of these briefly. Habitat, temporal, behavioral, mechanical, and gametic isolation. Starting with habitat isolation, this is where species live in different areas or occupy different habitats within the same area. So an example here is the mountain bluebird and the eastern bluebird. They live in the same general area, but the mountain bluebird lives in higher elevation and the eastern bluebird lives at lower elevation. That means they don't encounter one another, so they cannot reproduce successfully. In temporal isolation, we're talking about time. Now that can be different time of day, different time of year, different season. Basically, they're not out looking at the same time, so they don't encounter each other as potential mates, and they, again, cannot reproduce successfully. An example of that is the western spotted skunk and the eastern spotted skunk. One of them wants to mate in the late spring. The other one's looking for a mate in the late winter. They are not looking at the same time, so they will not reproduce, interbreed successfully. Behavioral isolation. You knew I had to shoehorn my favorite guys, the blue-footed boobies, in here somewhere. This is where something around mating, something behavioral, a ritual, a pattern, a dance, a song, something that helps individuals to signal to one another their potential as a mate is required for mating. And if that's not there, even if everything else would potentially work, they will not mate with one another. So behavioral isolation, some kind of behavior associated with mating. All right, mechanical isolation. This one is somewhat amusing, especially if you're talking about snails. This is where there's a physical fit that is lacking between the reproductive anatomy, like things don't fit together. And here's an example in this picture. I guess, now listen, I'm no snail expert. I don't really understand this 100%, but apparently if the spirals on the shells of snails are not spiraling the right way, then that can prevent physical fit. So that is an example. That would, of course, prevent successful reproduction. So that's another kind of reproductive isolation. And then finally, gametic isolation. So this is one where everything else is kind of going okay, but even when you put the egg and sperm together, they're like physically encountering each other, they cannot fertilize each other. So this is typically some sort of protein or other signal that's on the surface of the gametes that is required to interact in a certain way to allow fertilization that are lacking. So an example here is the sea urchin. The red and purple sea urchins can be in the same area and release their gametes into the same water, but they won't fertilize each other and make some sort of purpley blue sea urchin. That does not happen. So that is gametic isolation. All right, so those are the pre-zygotic barriers. Let's look at some post-zygotic barriers. Now with this, the fertilized egg is formed. We do have a zygote, but that zygote will not develop into a fertile, viable adult. So we still consider this to be reproductive isolation. 3 types, that is reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, and hybrid breakdown. Starting with reduced hybrid viability. So this is where the fertilized egg just won't really develop. An example here is sheeps can fertilize goats, but the embryo won't develop. Now, interestingly, when I was looking kind of for examples of this, apparently there are some forms of exception to this. I am not an expert, but in general, it will not develop. So that's reduced hybrid viability. There will be an embryo formed, but it just won't develop into, a baby that can be born. Next up, reduced hybrid fertility. I'm sure you are familiar with this example. This is where, yes, a baby can be born. It will live, but it cannot reproduce, so it will be sterile. The example here is the mule. You probably know that when you breed a horse and a donkey, you get a mule, and mules are like, they're strong, they can do a lot, they're not unhealthy, but they can't reproduce. Often this has something to do with differences in chromosome number. So here you can see they have different diploid and haploid numbers. The horse and the donkey, the mule ends up with 63, and that somehow prevents, I think, successful gamete production. Don't quote me on that, but that's going to prevent the mule from being fertile. And finally, hybrid breakdown. This is where you might have a, quote, baby offspring produced, and it may technically be viable and fertile, but it's typically really weak, and it will become even weaker in subsequent generations, ultimately dying out. So that's also considered reproductive isolation. Example shown at the right is a kind of rice, two kinds of rice being bred together. And you can see that they made a plant, a viable plant came out of it, but it doesn't look good. And this would only get worse with subsequent generations. So that was speciation. We're now going to look at a related idea, which is, are there any patterns that we can see in the formation of new species and over time, like the patterns in when this stuff happens and patterns in how this stuff happens? The pace of evolution refers to how quickly or slowly it happens. And for a very long time, we understood this pace to be like the picture on the left, gradualism. And that is that evolution is constantly happening. These changes are constantly going on, incremental changes over a long period, gradually accumulating until a new species emerge. And then that pattern can, continuing over and over and over, and so to form this branching out pattern and creating the diversity that we see in the world around us. Now that does happen, but that's not the only pattern. We also now understand that one of the reasons that we don't always see the many transitional forms in the fossil record that we would expect with a pattern like gradualism is because it's not the only pace that can occur. We also have something called punctuated equilibrium. And in this pattern, what we're going to see is long periods of what they call stasis, punctuated, see what they did there, by rapid periods of change in which you'll see new species emerge. Now, I do want to point out, we're talking about rapid in like geologic terms or evolutionary terms, which is still kind of a long time. But relatively speaking, like compared to gradualism, this is a rapid period of change. And because of this, we sometimes do not see as many transitional forms as we would expect with gradualism. You should know these two versions of evolution, and you should be able to sort of compare and contrast them. So gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. All right, moving on to patterns in evolution. So these things are all related to one another, right? You can kind of see how, yes, we're kind of moving to another subtopic, but this all has to do with speciation, and this also has to do with the pace of evolution, etc. Okay, so let's look at some patterns that we can see. We have mostly been looking at something called divergent evolution, which is how organisms can become more and more different from one another. We are going to look at some other patterns in a minute too, because this is not the only one. But before we move on, I want to show you a specific form of divergent evolution that you should know about. And this is one that Darwin observed when he went to the Galapagos Islands. He observed a wide variety of different finches on the Galapagos Islands and figured out that they probably all came from one common ancestor. And the idea is that this happens often in like island chains, that you have a common ancestor, and then as those populations start separating out into not only the different islands, but different niches within those islands. So like we're eating different foods, we're inhabiting different trees or different parts of trees. Some of us are on the ground, etc. Over time, that's going to create different selection pressures on these populations or subpopulations, and that's going to cause a bunch of different species to emerge from a single common ancestor. And that pattern of divergent evolution is called adaptive radiation. Another pattern we see is called convergent evolution. This one is very interesting to me. This is where you're going to end up with organisms that in certain ways look very similar to each other. But it's not because they're closely related evolutionarily. It is only because they just happen to live in similar environments and be experiencing similar selection pressures. So similar kinds of structures and things are adaptations for them. So if you look over on the right, you can see on two columns. One is for placental mammals. So these are the ones that are going to be more familiar to you, like they're on like North America, and Australian marsupial animals. And they're kind of arranged by their analogs, right? These are animals that look kind of similar or have similar adaptations, but these are not closely evolutionarily related at all. They're very sort of distantly related. And the reason they have similar adaptations, like the flying squirrel and the flying phalanger, both have those like little skin flaps that allow them to glide. They don't have those because they're related to each other closely. It's just because that was an adaptation for both of them to be able to glide from tree to tree. And then I really like this other example, and that's with vultures. The Nubian vulture from Africa and the New World vulture from the Americas, if you look at them, they do kind of look the same. They are not closely related. One is related to storks and one is related to hawks. I mean, obviously they're both birds, but they diverged a long time ago. But because they both are scavengers, they eat carrion, they both have the bald heads that you see with those kinds of birds. It allows them to sort of root around in the guts of a dead animal without like getting a bunch of guts on their feathers. So that's why they have that same adaptation. They do have differences. I just put, to one is using smell in addition to sight, one only uses sight. But I just wanted to kind of show you they look very similar, but they are not very closely related. And that's because of convergent evolution. There's also a name for the structures that are similar because of convergent evolution, and that is analogous structures. So here you can see that each of these four organisms have a wing or a wing-like structure, but they are, I'm sure you can just looking at them, you can see that they are, they're not evolutionarily related, really, but they also internally, structurally, are very, very different. They are just performing the same function for each of these individuals. And finally, extinction. We started talking about how new species emerge. We're going to talk a bit about how they end. So extinction, of course, is the termination of a species, where basically a species cannot adapt to a changing environment and therefore they die out. There are 5 mass extinctions recognized throughout Earth's history. Some scientists say that we are in the midst of the 6th. And I'm sure you're also aware that human activity has affected extinction rates for different species. So we have accelerated extinction for certain species, which is kind of sad. We've also helped to save a few, but it's not just humans, of course. Anytime there's an ecological stress or a big change in the environment, the selection pressures, you're going to see extinction rates rise. And then the silver lining there, just something to end on, is that if a species does go extinct, that niche that it did once inhabit is now open and available for a new species to emerge and move into. So it's kind of just that cycle of life. All right, well done. I will see you in class.